It's so good to see all of you tonight. It's just always a blessing. It's always a joy to come to East Tallassee, to be able to fellowship with you, to be able to interact with you. And as Mike said, I have such a special feeling for this congregation and for all of you. And I want to encourage you tonight before we get started. I want to encourage you in the things that you are doing, the things that you're doing for the Lord each and every day. I want to encourage you in those things. Okay. It's okay.
Go ahead. Keep encouraging.
Okay. I want to encourage you in the things you're doing every day out in the community. A lot of times the things that you do are only known by you and by God. You don't advertise them. You don't go around and make a big deal out of them. You just simply go out and you serve the Lord where you are. And maybe sometimes you feel like it's not worthwhile. Maybe you feel like nobody notices. Maybe you wonder if your labor is in vain. But I want to encourage you tonight that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. And I want to encourage you to be steadfast, as Paul said, and immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Continue to do what you're doing and continue to trust in Jesus and to serve Him. Tonight, if you'll turn to Luke chapter 15, we'll take the majority of our lesson from that chapter. Luke chapter 15, and we want to begin tonight by reading verses 11 through 24. If you'll follow along in your Bibles, Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 24. Then he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare? And I perish with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. It was not unusual for the Pharisees and the scribes to complain about Jesus. So on this occasion, the Lord drew the ire of the religious leaders by keeping company with the tax collectors and the sinners. You can read about that in Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Now, in response to that, Jesus told 3 parables that are recorded here in Luke chapter 15. He told the parable of the lost sheep, he told the parable of the lost coin, and then he told this parable that we just read part of about really 2 lost sons. So he tells these three parables. And in this third parable that is contained here in verses 11 and on through verse 32, Jesus spoke about two brothers. These two sons were brothers. And that reveals an important truth, that he was referring to people who were all Jews. He was talking about wayward Jews, the tax collectors and the sinners, and arrogant Jews, who were the Pharisees and the scribes. But they were all in the family of God, so to speak, at that time. And it was the younger brother, the one who left home, that ended up coming back. And the older brother, at the end of the story, was outside of the house, while the younger brother was inside. He returned. And you know, today I think there's still something wonderful about returning home. Have you ever gone on a long journey and been ready to come home? Have you ever been in the hospital before and been ready to come home? Sometimes you can just walk down the street and you're ready to come home. There's something good about coming home. And you know, this applies, I think, even more in the spiritual realm. Because sometimes, even though as Christians, we're in the family of God, but sometimes we wander, don't we? Don't we drift sometimes? Don't we end up away from God sometimes? Sometimes it might be a slow process where circumstances come along and we just kind of wander away from God. But then there's other times we might be like this younger son. We might say, you know, I'm tired of God. I'm tired of his rules. I'm tired of living for him. And we just defy the Lord and we leave. Whatever the case, a return is in order. And I think that's where the parable of this son can help us. As we consider this story from Jesus, I think it encourages the wayward child of God to come back home, to return again. And not only that, but it shows us the benefits of making that decision to leave the far country and to come back to God. So with that in mind, tonight we want to go back through this text again. And I want to share with you some lessons from this younger son's return. We're not going to look at the older son tonight. We want to focus on the younger son and his return to the Father. And I believe there's some good things here for us tonight that will help us. And perhaps, if you're here tonight and maybe you've wandered a little bit, it'll cause you to consider to come back again. And then maybe if you're not wandering, hopefully it'll encourage you to stay home and to not leave to go to the far country. So let's just notice a few things from this text. Number one, I want you to see where the younger son returned from. Let's look at verses 11 through 16 again. A certain man had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. I think it's important to notice that the younger son was at one time in the house of his father. He was where he needed to be at one time, but he chose to depart. He chose to leave. He asked for his share of the inheritance. He was tired of living with his father, and he gathered all together, and Jesus said he journeyed to a far country. He left home for another place. Now, he didn't go next door. He didn't go see the neighbors. He didn't go see family members in another town. He journeyed a long ways away. He went to the far country. And once he was there, he found some things. And I want to share with you 5 things he found. Number 1, he found a life without restraint. He wasted his living. Number 2, he found a life of emptiness. He had nothing. Number 3, he found himself in want, meaning that he did not have the things he needed. Number 4, he found himself in a degrading situation. He was in a pig pen. And number 5, he found himself with no relationships. He had no friends. The younger son lived in the far country, and yet he had no life. He had nothing good. He had nothing redeeming. He had nothing meaningful. He was alive, but yet he was merely existing. And I think it's important for us to understand this is where he returned from when he decided to go home. Why is this important? This is important because the far country is symbolic of the world. When the younger son launched out to go to the far country, he was excited. He believed that it offered something great. He had seen all the advertisements. He had heard all the stories about how wonderful it would be. And yet when he got there, he found absolutely nothing. And that's the way it is when we talk about the world. The world offers the child of God everything. The world flashes glory before us as Christians. The world tries to pull us in. But yet, the world delivers nothing. And when we leave home, when we wander from God, my friends, this is where we go. We go to the far country. And living there will rob us of joy. It'll rob us of discipline. It'll rob us of fulfillment, of honor, and of relationships. It is a lonely place, similar to the far country that the younger son traveled to. It is not a place that children of God should be. God doesn't want us to live of the world. God has delivered us from that and wants us to stay with Him. This young son thought he would have everything. He had nothing. I ask you tonight, have you left your spiritual home for the far country of the world? Only to realize it's not all that you thought it would be. There's nothing there. You're empty and you're unfulfilled. Let me encourage you, come back tonight. Whatever you leave behind in the world is worth it. Whatever you leave behind in the far country is worth it. Where you're coming from cannot compare with what you're returning to when you come back home. So the first thing we see from this story of the younger son's return, we see where the younger son returned from. But there's something better. What was waiting for him? That leads us to our next point. Not only where the younger son returned from, we see what the younger son returned to. Now let's read verses 17 through 19. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." Jesus said the younger son came to himself. He had a realization. He saw the predicament that he was in. And notice what he said. This is very telling. He said, "I have sinned." Now, Now, just stopping right there for a minute and making just another point. That's what will lead us into the far country. I have sinned. The young son sinned when he rebelled against his father. He sinned when he left for the reasons he left for. And then he sinned when he was in the far country. And when I look back on my life, the times that I have been separated from God have been for one reason. I have sinned. I have fallen into sin, and it will always, always separate us from the Father when we leave Him and we go to the far country. The young son said, I have sinned against heaven and before you. What a great realization. What a great confession he made. He was now ready to depart. He was ready to leave, but this time he was leaving the far country instead of leaving for the far country. And now here comes something great. What will he return to? What will he return to? We've heard that old saying before, you can't go home again. Oh, yes, you can. You can go home again. Let's notice what he returned to. The younger son said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? What was he returning to? He was returning to everything. He was returning to everything. In the house of his father, there was bread enough and to spare. That means there was more than enough. There was more than sufficient. There was everything he could ever desire and need was taken care of. Nothing was lacking. When he came back, he returned to food on the table, clothes to wear, shelter over his head, a family relationship. Even the servants who worked in his father's house had more than he did in the far country. And he said, make me like one of your hired servants. What did he come back to? He came back to everything. What did he leave behind? Nothing. Nothing. What a wonderful return, coming back to everything. And when I think about today, I think about our lives. When we have wandered away from God and we decide to come home spiritually, what do we come home to? We come home to everything. We feed on the Word of God. We are clothed in the riches of His goodness. We are under the shelter of His wings. In the far country, we were destitute, alone, and despondent. But when we return, there is provision, there is relationship, there is joy. And my friends, there is bread enough and to spare. There is more than we could ever need when we come back to the Father's house. I want to share with you from 2 Peter chapter 1 just a few of the things that we enjoy in the Father's house. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 2, going through verse 4. The writer says, grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord, as His divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of Him who called us by glory and virtue, by which have been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Notice what we come back to. Notice what's in the Father's house. Number one, grace and peace. Number two, the knowledge of God and Jesus. Number three, the divine power to give us all things that pertain to life and to godliness. Number four, great and precious promises that we can count on. Number 5, the divine nature. And last of all, an escape. An escape from the world. An escape from the far country. This is what we come home to. And I want to encourage you tonight, if you may be away tonight, leave the far country, because what you leave there will not compare in any way with what you return to. So we see this younger son. We see where he returned from. He returned from the far country. We see what he returned to. He returned to everything. And now we see who he returned to. Notice in verse 20. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. He arose and came home? No. He arose and traveled down the road? No. He arose and came to his father. The thought of his father moved the son to head home. Now, I think it's worth noting here, the father did not send out a delegation to meet his son. And the father did not have his servants all out there watching for his son. He was there. He welcomed his son. He embraced his son. Who did the younger son return to? He returned to a loving father. And I want to share with you quickly 3 great qualities of this father. Number 1, he watched for his son's return. Jesus said when he was a great way off, the father saw him. He watched for the return. Number 2, he wanted his son to return. He had the desire for his son to come home. And number 3, he was willing. He was willing to restore his son when he returned. This father longed for his son. He wanted his son to be back home, and he poured out his love as a demonstration of that great desire. Who did the younger son come back to? He returned to his father. Now, for you and I today, God is the Father who longs to see us come back. He watches for us. He willingly receives us when we decide to come back. He rejoices with us and restores us in his house. And you know, I'm thankful that God is not like we are. I saw many occasions in the past when I worked for a big company where someone would get in trouble and they would have to go groveling back to the manager or the supervisor, and that person would hold it over their head for the next 10 years that they made some kind of mistake and never treat them the same again. And that's how things are done in the world. But I'm so thankful that's not how God is. I'm so thankful that when we come back, God doesn't hold it over our heads. And God doesn't make us do something embarrassing and humiliating. That He receives us, and He wants us, and He desires for us to come home. God is the Father that we come home to. I want to share with you very quickly some wonderful gifts this father gave his son when he came home. Number 1, he said, bring out the best robe, which, among other things, symbolizes sonship. You are my son. Number 2, he said, put a ring on his hand, which signified position and opportunity. Number 3, he said, put sandals on his feet, which allowed this younger son to walk. And number 4, he said, get the fatted calf that we've been saving for a celebration and kill it, and let's have a celebration. Some beautiful gifts that the Father gave to his Son. And you know, God offers all of that today. When we come home, we get the robe because we're his children. We get the ring because we have a position of honor with him through Christ. We get the shoes so we can walk with the Lord every day. And we get a place at the table of God to rejoice with him. This is who we return to. A Father who wants us. A Father who loves us. So when we consider this story that Jesus told, this story about this younger son, at least the portion we read tonight, here was somebody who left home. And where did he return from? He returned from the far country, a place of emptiness. What did he return to? He returned to everything. Who did he return to? He returned to a Father who wanted him and loved him and restored him. And tonight, when we apply that to our lives, if we have wandered away, if we're living in the far country, it's time to come home. It's time to arise and go to the Father tonight. Now, as we close, I want to go back to Luke 15 and verse 20. Jesus said he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. Sometimes we believe the most important part of this story is when the young man came to himself. And that's certainly important. But equally important is when he arose and did something about it. When he got up and he actually went back to his Father. And tonight, if you need to come back to the Father, that's the important part. Not just to think about it, not just to say you're going to, but to arise and come to your Father. But then I want you to notice something else. I want you to notice 3 things. In the far country, his friends ran away from him. When he came home, his father ran to him. In the far country, he attached himself to a citizen who didn't care about him. When he came home, his father attached himself to him and embraced him. And when he was in the far country, no one gave him anything. When he came home, his father gave him everything. If you're away tonight, it is time to arise and go to your Father. If you need to do that, please do while we stand and while we sing.